step back and say, what are you after? What are you after? What's the effect going to be? What's the reader taking away from it? I think there's many strong things, especially in the beginning of a book. Especially in the beginning. I don't think you have anything to...
I also came to, and it is very interesting because, so I wrote a response. This letter came in, which was wonderful. I mean, it is, you don't have many opportunities to have discussions like this, right? Which is one of the reasons I did this, put out these two very, very different versions of the text, is just to let people see, first of all, that, this kind of stuff happens, and to try and get the discussion going. So I was very, very happy to get this letter. And then I did write a response in which I am much more eloquent, I hope, than although the sentences, I have to say, are very, very long in a response, because the person who was writing into me said something about how English writing, nowadays nobody is allowed to write long sentences. So I wrote flamboyantly long sentences because I always write long sentences anyway. But, one of the points that I made, as I recall, in that response was that you have to, or maybe it was in the original interview, I don't remember. I think maybe you have to distinguish between texts, translating a text, and producing a translation of a book. Or you can think in terms of moving a text from one language into another, although I don't really like the metaphorical. The idea of translation as movement or crossing over is not something I'm a fan of, really, but just sticking with the metaphor for the time being. You can think of translation in those terms, yes, but you also have to think of translation in terms of, to repeat that metaphor, moving a book from one literary system into another literary system, from one environment that has its own rules and is kind of, to a certain extent, self-contained, right, to another that has its own rules. To give a kind of an obvious example, in Japan, long books like this are not at all uncommon, right? It's not at all. There's another book that I really love that was published when it came out in paperback. It was in 4 volumes. And it's a bestseller. It does really well, and people like that kind of stuff. People have, and why? I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why this is true. One of the reasons I discovered when I was living in Tokyo, I spent 2.5 years recently in Tokyo doing dissertation research. I was commuting on a train. You spend in Tokyo, if you're, a third the population of Japan lives in Tokyo, so you spend a lot of time on trains. You need them. There are all kinds of little reasons for this. And the result is that basically, if you're thinking in terms of translating a book from one environment to another, you do have to think about different kinds of issues. Right? It's not just text.
It's not simple. It's not a simple question.
And I think it's important to remember that translations have to be not simply judged against the original. It's the effectiveness of the translation itself. And it's never possible to just carry from one language into another. It doesn't function like that. You're creating a new context, giving it a new meaning in a different language, a different historical period also, possibly.
So, I want you to carry on with that in relation to the, you want to write a book that you're translating for us, but first, and the all-important question, how did you get into translation and being the dean of the translation school?
Well, living most of my life in Barcelona, Catalonia, this is a bilingual region, so we would constantly move between Spanish and Catalan, and being a native speaker of English. Translation, which is sort of a daily part of my life. I also worked in French, so in any given day I might be moving between any of these 4 languages. I thought I'd stop and mention the Catalan language. We mentioned this earlier. Many people think it's a dialect when actually it is an old Romance language. Yes, it's similar to Spanish, and it has many syntactical, lexical resemblances, shared etymologies. But in some ways it's closer to French and Italian. And because it was so brutally repressed under Franco, well, of course, it's invested with this nationalism now. But it has a literature that dates back to the 12th century. It's actually a literature that's quite readable. It's not changed very much. the Homilias d'Orgagna, a set of sermons from the 12th century. I can read quite easily, which certainly is not the case of Chaucer 2 centuries later. But translation was always very important in the Catalan language, in normativizing the language and creating, contributing to the formation of national identity. But my theoretical interest in translation came about the time I became the founding dean of the School of Translation. But what happened is, as I'm reading translation theory, well, I'm setting up a 4-year BA in translation, then a master's, PhD. I had no time for translating. So what happens, paradoxically, I leave the School of Translation and the post of dean about the time I moved to New York or started living between New York and Barcelona, and I had more time to devote to translating. So I was always tremendously interested in Mercè Rodoreda, the Catalan writer. She actually was from the neighborhood where I lived in Barcelona. So most of her novels, not the novel I just finished translating for Open Letter, but most of her other novels, some of her short stories are set in this neighborhood. And I found her short stories absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing. The strangeness, the syntax, these long, singing stream of consciousness were just very unusual, innovative. And I started publishing some of her translations. The idea was to work toward collecting a book collection, which I ended up putting on the back burner. And then, I moved into translating some other more contemporary writers. Rodoreda lived from 1908. This is the 100th anniversary of her birth. She died in 1983. So she was one of the great writers in Catalan literature. Her most famous novel was Plaça del Diamant, which was translated by David Rosenthal into English, The Time of the Doves. And it's a novel that's been translated in 25 languages, but like most Catalan literature, is just relatively unknown in Anglophone countries. And then I started working on, I just finished the translation of Death in Spring. It's a surrealistic novel, mythical world of, it's just nothing really like this in Catalan literature or other literatures, I'll say. Ritual violence, strange, considerable difficulty in finding a voice for this male narrator. The only of Rodoreda's books with a male narrator, or male protagonist, for that matter. So if all of translation is basically decontextualizing, rewriting, recontextualizing, creating a new identity, it just seemed that this was so much more difficult. And the extraordinarily difficult syntax, which is not standard Catalan syntax. Rodoreda was going to make this novel as strange in every way as she could. And no Catalan philology could help me. It was a matter of just unpacking some of these sentences, unpacking the syntax, and trying to make sense of it, and then reassembling it. But Rodoreda was influenced by several writers. Joyce, Virginia Woolf. One of the short stories that I published by her was reminded me very much of Virginia Woolf. These long sentences, paragraphs of one sentence. So I went back to reading To a White House. D.H. Lawrence. So I was reading these, trying to develop a lexicon, and I happened to be in May. I was in Florence, Italy, and this was the 80th anniversary of Lawrence's private publication of Lady Chatterley's Lovers. So